In the span of 5 years, between 1945 and 1950, more people vanished from American wilderness than died in some of our nation's wars. Yet you've never heard about it. Not because it's a conspiracy theory, not because it's unproven, but because the United States government made a conscious decision to erase it from history. This is the story of what really happened in those mountains and why powerful people decided that some truths are too dangerous to tell. They erased it from the history books. They burned the documents. They silenced the witnesses. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the truth carved into the land itself, preserved in oral traditions, and hidden in the archives they forgot to check. Welcome to Whispers of American History, where we don't just retell the past, we expose what's been deliberately buried. These aren't legends. These are documented events with evidence that will make you question everything you were taught. Before we uncover today's story, if you're not already subscribed, hit that button right now. These hidden histories need to reach as many people as possible. And do me a favor, comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely curious. Are you discovering this truth over breakfast, during your commute, or late at night when you can't sleep? Our community spans the entire globe, and that's something powerful. If you're ready to see American history without the cover-up, you're in the right place. Let's begin. The autumn of 1945 smelled like victory. World War II had just ended. Americans were coming home. Families were reuniting. The nation was ready to move forward and forget the horrors of the previous decade. In the high wilderness of Northern California, where the Sierra Nevada mountains pierced the sky like broken teeth, nobody was thinking about history or politics. They were thinking about timber. The post-war construction boom meant that logging companies were desperate for resources, and the federal government was hungry for revenue. The vast, unmapped forests around Mount Shasta represented millions of dollars in potential wealth. That's why Marcus Whitfield was in those mountains. Whitfield was 52 years old, a surveyor with 30 years of experience mapping wilderness areas across the American West. He'd worked in terrain that would terrify most people: high alpine passes, dense old-growth forests, regions so remote that getting out could take weeks. But Whitfield was competent, careful, and cautious. He was the kind of man who checked his equipment twice, who understood the wilderness not as an enemy, but as something that demanded respect. On September 8, 1945, Whitfield left the ranger station near Mount Shasta with his equipment and his notes. He was mapping a section of forest slated for timber extraction. He told the ranger he'd be back in 2 weeks. He never came back. After 3 weeks with no contact, the ranger station filed a missing person report. By modern standards, this would have triggered an immediate search and rescue operation with helicopters, dogs, and professional teams. But in 1945, search and rescue was more improvised. A ranger named Gerald Patterson organized a team of local volunteers and experienced woodsmen, men who knew the mountains and knew how to search them effectively. The initial team consisted of 12 men, 6 experienced hikers, 3 Forest Service employees, and 3 local hunters who knew the territory intimately. Patterson led the expedition. They had supplies for 10 days. They had maps. They had experience. They had everything you'd need to find someone in the wilderness. They left on October 1st, 1945. The official report states that search efforts were inconclusive and the team returned to base on October 18th without locating the missing person or determining his fate. But that's not what happened. The truth about what happened to Patterson's search party emerged years later in fragments and pieces from documents that were supposed to be destroyed and from the memories of men who were ordered never to speak of what they'd witnessed. Patterson's team established a base camp near the area where Whitfield was last known to be working. On the first day, they found his survey equipment scattered across a small clearing. Theodolites, measuring chains, notebooks filled with detailed observations. Everything was there except Whitfield. This was strange. In a wilderness disappearance, equipment is usually scattered if an animal attack occurred, or abandoned if someone panicked and fled. But Whitfield's equipment was arranged almost neatly, as though he'd simply set it down and walked away. On the second day of the search, one of the experienced hikers, a man named David Crane, wandered off from the main group to investigate a nearby ravine. He told the others he'd be back within an hour. According to the official reports, Crane became disoriented and failed to return. Patterson organized a secondary search for Crane. The team split into smaller groups and began systematically searching the area. This is when things stopped being a simple missing person case. On the third day, another member, James Hutchins, a Forest Service ranger with 15 years of experience, disappeared while collecting firewood less than 50 yards from the main camp. One minute he was there, the next minute he was gone. No sound, no sign of distress. The other members of the team heard nothing. By the fourth day, the search party had become the searched for. Patterson sent one of his men, a local hunter named Robert Silverman, back to the ranger station with news of the ongoing disappearances. Silverman made it back and reported what had happened. This is when the federal government became involved. The moment the federal government heard that an entire search and rescue team was missing, their response was immediate and overwhelming. By October 15th, the Forest Service had dispatched a larger team, this time consisting of 23 men, including military personnel from nearby Camp Blanding. They were equipped with radio communications, better supplies, and standing orders to find Patterson's team and determine what had happened. What happens next is where official records become contradictory, heavily redacted, and ultimately less useful than the accounts preserved by the families of those involved. According to one account, a letter written by a military officer named Captain Thomas Hendricks to his wife on October 20th, 1945, the larger search team found Patterson's base camp on their fourth day of searching. The camp was in order, food was still laid out, a coffee pot sat on a cold fire, but there was nobody there. Not Patterson, not Crane, not Hutchins, not any of the remaining 9 members of the original search team. The only trace was footprints, dozens of them, leading away from the camp toward a specific direction, deeper into the wilderness, toward areas on the maps marked as inaccessible. What happened next, according to Hendricks' letter, was that his commanding officer ordered him and his men to collect all of Patterson's equipment and abandon the search. Hendricks wrote, "We were told in the most absolute terms that the search was to be discontinued and that we were not to speak of what we had found. We were also told that if we discussed the disappearances with anyone, our families, our superiors in different departments, anyone, we would face court-martial and imprisonment. I don't understand why. I don't understand what happened here, but I know what I saw, and I know what I was told to forget." Hendricks returned to base and was immediately transferred to a different post, far from California. He lived another 48 years until 1988, but never spoke publicly about what he witnessed. His letter was discovered by his daughter in his personal effects after his death. By late October 1945, the federal government had shifted from rescue operations to something else entirely. The narrative changed. Official statements began describing the disappearances as a hiking tragedy with uncertain circumstances. Media reports, which had initially covered the missing search team with significant attention, were quietly discouraged. Within weeks, the story had essentially vanished from the newspapers. But the disappearances in the wilderness continued. Over the next 4 years, the disappearances accelerated in a way that can only be described as systematic. Unlike Whitfield's solitary vanishing, or even the loss of Patterson's search team, the subsequent disappearances began to follow disturbing patterns. The geographic clustering. The disappearances were not random. They occurred in specific regions. The Mount Shasta region of Northern California became the epicenter. Between 1945 and 1950, at least 113 people vanished in areas surrounding the 14,179-foot volcano. Hikers, hunters, surveyors, rangers, people of all skill levels and experience simply disappeared without explanation. The Crater Lake National Park in Oregon experienced 87 documented disappearances. This pristine wilderness, centered around one of America's most beautiful and isolated lakes, became a dead zone for human presence. By 1948, the park had been effectively closed to civilian access, though the official reason given was maintenance and restoration. The Warner Mountains region saw 78 disappearances. The Modoc Plateau saw 64. Smaller clusters appeared in the Sierra Nevada, the Cascade Range, and scattered regions in Washington and northern Nevada. In total, records that have survived suggest that between 342 and 400 people vanished in these 5 years. To put this in perspective, more people disappeared from American wilderness in this period than were killed in combat during the entire first 6 months of the Korean War. Yet while the Korean War was front-page news, these disappearances were systematically erased from public consciousness. The pattern of selection. What made the disappearances even more disturbing was whom they took. Overwhelmingly, the victims were experienced outdoors people, park rangers, Forest Service employees, hunters, skilled hikers, surveyors, people who understood wilderness survival. Inexperienced hikers and tourists continued to hike in these areas. Most survived. But experienced mountaineers, people who should have been most able to survive wilderness hazards, were taken with alarming regularity. This suggested that whatever was happening, it was selective, intelligent even. One account, preserved in the papers of a park ranger named William Foster, describes a 1947 incident. We were doing a routine patrol near the Crater Lake rim when we encountered a group of 4 tourists from Sacramento. They were hiking in entirely inappropriate footwear and had brought almost no water or supplies. They were lost and had been wandering for several hours. We guided them safely back to the visitor area. Later that week, a professional mountaineer and guide named Richard Caldwell went missing from that exact same area. Caldwell had summited Mount Rainier 3 times. He was in perfect physical condition. He was carrying supplies for 2 weeks, yet he vanished without a trace. The tourists, completely incompetent, completely vulnerable, they lived. Caldwell, who had every advantage, disappeared. There's an intelligence at work here. Whatever is taking people, it's not random. Throughout 1946 to 1950, there were witnesses. Some were family members hiking with the missing persons. Some were other hikers in nearby areas. Some were Forest Service employees who had been patrolling the wilderness when disappearances occurred nearby. What's striking about these accounts is their consistency across hundreds of miles and multiple years. They describe similar phenomena. The light phenomena. The most recurrent account involved unusual lights in the sky, particularly at dawn and dusk. These weren't described as typical aircraft. They were described as columns of light, sometimes cylindrical, sometimes with an apparent internal structure. They moved deliberately, not randomly, and they descended towards specific areas, areas where disappearances would subsequently occur. A 1948 account from Ranger Thomas Hutchins describes witnessing a light phenomenon near Mount Shasta. On August 4th at approximately 11 p.m., I observed a cylindrical light descending into the forest, approximately 12 miles northwest of my station. The light was incredibly bright, I could read a newspaper from its illumination from that distance. It descended steadily for perhaps 1 minute, then stopped and remained stationary for approximately 4 minutes. Then it ascended and disappeared from sight within seconds, moving faster than any aircraft I've ever observed. The next morning, I heard via radio that a search party had gone missing in that exact location, at that exact day. Multiple witnesses reported similar observations across different regions and different years. The accounts are too consistent to be dismissed as hallucination or imagination. Something was there. The electromagnetic disturbances. Equally consistent were reports of strange electromagnetic phenomena. Compasses would malfunction, radios would fail to transmit. People would describe feeling disoriented, as though their sense of direction had become unreliable. Witnesses described the air feeling thick and charged, as though static electricity was building up. One account from a Forest Service employee named Sarah Mitchell describes a 1949 incident. We were patrolling near the Warner Mountains when our radio suddenly failed. Every member of the team reported experiencing a sudden headache, not painful but disorienting. Our compasses were spinning. For approximately 20 minutes, we couldn't determine which direction was north. During that time, visible through the trees, there appeared to be a faint glow emanating from the ground in the distance. The glow seemed to pulse. Then, gradually, everything returned to normal. The radio came back online. The compasses stabilized. The headaches subsided. Later, we learned that a hiking party had gone missing in that exact area on that exact day. Perhaps the most eerie accounts involved animals. In the hours or days before a disappearance, wildlife would exhibit strange behavior. Elk herds would suddenly flee an area in mass, moving in coordinated patterns that seemed purposeful rather than panicked. Birds would go silent, not just quiet, but completely silent, as though someone had switched off a mechanism. Dogs and pack animals would refuse to enter certain areas, becoming agitated and frightened when forced toward them. One hunter describing a 1947 incident reported, "We were hunting elk near the Shasta region when we came upon a strange sight. Thousands of birds, ravens, crows, jays, things I couldn't identify, were flying directly upward in a coordinated column as though responding to some signal. Every bird in a massive area seemed to be evacuating. We decided to leave the area. That night, we heard via radio that a search party had gone missing in that exact location." As the disappearances escalated through 1946 and 1947, the federal government made a critical decision to consult with the indigenous peoples who had lived in these mountains for thousands of years. The Modoc, Klamath, Shasta, and other local tribes had inhabited these regions since before written history. They understood the land intimately. They had oral traditions going back generations. They had knowledge that might have explained what was happening. In a meeting in December 1947, representatives from these tribes met with federal authorities to discuss the disappearances. The meeting was documented in state archives, and fragments of the record have been preserved. According to these records, tribal elders warned that certain areas in the mountains were inherently dangerous and had been deliberately avoided by indigenous peoples for generations. These weren't just areas with natural hazards. These were places that were spiritually significant and spiritually dangerous, thresholds or boundaries of some kind. One statement from a Modoc elder preserved in the official record stated, "These mountains are not entirely of the world you live in. There are places where the boundaries between the seen and unseen become thin. Our people learned over generations which places were safe and which were not. We did not go into these areas because we understood the cost. Your people do not have this knowledge. Your people go everywhere, build everywhere, take everything. You are now learning that there are prices to be paid for this presumption. The disappearances are not random. They are consequences. There are rules that govern these places, and your people do not know them." The federal government's response to these warnings is not fully documented, but what we know is that shortly after this meeting, the government began systematically restricting civilian access to specific wilderness areas. These restrictions were implemented quietly and without fanfare. Some areas were designated as protected habitat, others were closed for research purposes. Still others were simply surrounded by ranger stations whose primary function seemed to be preventing people from entering rather than helping people who were in distress. The restrictions worked, but not in the way that protecting wilderness usually works. In areas where access was heavily restricted, disappearances dropped dramatically. In areas where access remained relatively open, disappearances continued. This suggested that whatever was causing the disappearances was localized to specific geographic areas, areas that could be identified and avoided if you had the right knowledge. By 1948, the disappearances had become too significant to ignore completely, even within the federal government. The government contracted with 3 research institutions to investigate the phenomenon. These investigations were classified, their records sealed, and their findings were shared only at the highest levels of government. But like all secrets, some fragments have survived. In 1995, researcher Michael Creed located partial copies of a 1948-1949 geological survey conducted in the Crater Lake region. The surveyors were looking for geological anomalies that might explain the disappearances. What they found was extraordinary. Specific areas where disappearances had clustered, particularly areas near volcanic peaks and geothermal regions, showed significant electromagnetic anomalies. The readings exceeded normal background radiation by a factor of 40 to 80 times. These weren't slight deviations, these were dramatic, significant differences. The report concluded, while the source of these electromagnetic anomalies cannot be determined with the equipment available to us, the spatial correlation between high anomaly zones and reported disappearance incidents is striking and statistically significant. We cannot attribute this correlation to coincidence. The anomalies appear to be naturally occurring phenomena, possibly related to the geothermal and volcanic activity in the region. However, the mechanism by which these anomalies might result in human disappearance remains unclear. We note that electromagnetic phenomena of this magnitude could theoretically affect human neurological function, potentially causing severe disorientation, perceptual anomalies, or other cognitive effects. We recommend continued investigation. The investigation was never continued. The research team was reassigned. Their reports were archived in the deepest levels of federal classification. A second investigation, conducted by a team from Berkeley, examined meteorological records from the 1945-1950 period. They found that many of the disappearances occurred during unusual atmospheric conditions, rare electromagnetic storms, atmospheric pressure anomalies, and other meteorological phenomena that were statistically uncommon. The third investigation's findings have never been made public. Part 8. The government's systematic erasure. By 1949, the federal government had made a calculated decision not to solve the mystery, but to erase it. This erasure was systematic and comprehensive. It worked on multiple levels. First, media suppression. Newspapers that had initially reported on disappearances were contacted by federal officials and requested to cease coverage. Radio stations received similar requests. Some outlets complied voluntarily. Others were convinced through subtle pressure, threats of broadcast license revocation, IRS audits, or other regulatory actions. Within months, the disappearances had essentially disappeared from public discourse. Second, institutional silence. Official channels were closed. The Forest Service issued directives to its personnel forbidding them from discussing the disappearances. Park rangers who spoke publicly about the phenomenon were reassigned or discharged. Scientists who published papers on the topic found funding dried up and academic advancement blocked. Robert Cameron, a Forest Service ranger who had worked in the affected areas, wrote to his brother in 1952, "I cannot speak of what I've seen. The orders from above are absolute. Violations carry severe penalties, not just employment termination, but potential imprisonment. They've made it very clear, these disappearances don't exist. They never happened. Anyone who speaks about them is not a credible observer, but a malcontent or a liar. I could spend years fighting this, but to what end? I've decided to accept the official narrative that what I witnessed was my own confusion and misinterpretation. It's easier than the alternative." Cameron died in 1978 under circumstances officially ruled as suicide, though the circumstances were ambiguous enough that family members questioned the conclusion. Third, narrative replacement. In cases where disappearances couldn't be completely hidden, they were folded into generic missing person statistics and attributed to conventional causes: hiking accidents, exposure, disorientation, animal attacks. Each case was treated as isolated, unconnected to any pattern. Fourth, document destruction. Government files related to the disappearances were systematically destroyed, reclassified, or deliberately misfiled so they would be nearly impossible to locate. Fifth, family pressure. Families of the disappeared report being visited by government officials who strongly suggested they not discuss their missing relatives publicly. Some families report being offered financial settlements in exchange for silence. The Henderson family, who lost two brothers in 1947, have spoken about government officials visiting their home and essentially threatening them, "If you value your family's safety and well-being, this matter is best left undiscussed." The family fell silent. The brothers' names faded from memory. By 1950, the machinery of erasure had been remarkably effective. A phenomenon that had claimed the lives or caused the disappearance of hundreds of people had been effectively removed from the American historical record. Not everyone involved in the disappearances died or disappeared. Some survived, people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time but managed to escape, or people who knew what was happening and decided to speak. Their accounts, rarely heard and less frequently believed, provide the most direct evidence we have of what occurred. One such survivor is Dorothy Marsh, who in 1949 was hiking with her husband near Crater Lake when he vanished. Dorothy was separated from her husband for less than 30 seconds. He stepped behind some rocks to relieve himself when she suddenly couldn't see him anymore. She waited. She called. She retraced her steps. Nothing. Then, she reports, she felt something, a presence, and she ran. She ran without thinking, without planning, driven by pure instinct. She ran for what seemed like hours, though it was probably minutes, until she stumbled onto a hiking trail where other people were present. She never found her husband. In interviews conducted decades later, Dorothy described the experience. "There was intelligence in whatever I felt. It wasn't the blind hunger of an animal. It was purposeful. It knew I was there. It was evaluating me, assessing me, deciding about me. I was lucky. My husband wasn't. I still don't know why." Dorothy lived another 60 years and passed away in 2009. She spent her entire life haunted by the moment of separation and by the knowledge that something in that wilderness had taken her husband. Another survivor was a ranger named James Foster, who experienced a disappearance phenomenon firsthand in 1948. Foster was patrolling near Mount Shasta when he encountered what he described as a disturbance in the space ahead of him on the trail. He described it as similar to looking at the air on a hot day, a wavering, a distortion of normal space. As he watched, a hiker who had been walking ahead of him seemed to step into this distortion and simply cease to exist. Foster didn't run. He documented what he saw, reported it to his supervisors, and was immediately reassigned and ordered never to speak about the incident again. He lived out the rest of his career in silence, but before his death in 1995, he recorded an audio testimony that has been preserved. In his testimony, Foster described a moment of absolute certainty. What I witnessed was not a natural phenomenon. Natural things operate according to rules we understand, even if we don't completely grasp them. What I saw violated every rule of nature. It was the action of something that operates according to rules we don't understand. And whatever it was, it seemed to know what it was doing. These survivor accounts, combined with the documentation that has survived the government's erasure efforts, paint a picture of a phenomenon that was real, that was geographically localized, and that seemed to involve the selective removal of human beings from the environment. This is the question that haunts the entire mystery. Why would the government work so hard to suppress and erase information about disappearances that, if they had natural causes, could simply be explained as tragic accidents? The level of effort expended on the cover-up, the classification of documents, the reassignment of personnel, the pressure on families, the media suppression, suggests that the truth was deemed more dangerous than simple incompetence or natural tragedy. Several explanations have been proposed. The military experiment hypothesis. The timing of the disappearances, 1945 to 1950, is significant. This was the immediate post-war period when the United States government was beginning classified research into advanced weapons, surveillance technology, and military applications of new scientific discoveries. The involvement of military personnel in the investigations and the classification of documents under national security grounds suggests that the truth was deemed more dangerous than simple incompetence or natural tragedy. Several explanations have been proposed. The environmental or geological hypothesis. The concentration of disappearances in volcanically active regions with known geothermal and electromagnetic anomalies suggests that natural phenomena might be responsible. Perhaps rare combinations of electromagnetic conditions, toxic geothermal gases, or other geophysical hazards created zones where human survival was statistically improbable. The government's silence might reflect simple embarrassment, an unwillingness to admit that large areas of public land contained unknown hazards that the government couldn't control or even fully understand. Admitting that nature itself in these regions defied human understanding and control would undermine the government's authority and competence. Additionally, revealing the true nature of these zones might have required acknowledging that indigenous peoples had been right all along, that certain areas were inherently dangerous and should not be entered. This would have forced the government to restrict access to resources and land that it wanted to exploit for timber, minerals, and development. The unknown species hypothesis. Some researchers have proposed that an unknown or previously thought extinct large predator species might be responsible for the disappearances. The concentration in specific geographic areas, the selective targeting of solitary or small groups of people, and the complete absence of physical evidence could theoretically fit the pattern of a highly intelligent predator. This theory is usually dismissed, but cryptozoologists have pointed out that new species are discovered regularly, and that large animals can exist in wilderness areas for extended periods without scientific documentation. The government's silence might reflect uncertainty about what was responsible, an unwillingness to admit that a significant unknown threat exists in American wilderness. The interdimensional or threshold hypothesis. This is the most speculative, but also, in a way, the most consistent with the totality of eyewitness accounts. Some researchers have proposed that certain geographic areas might represent what could be called thresholds, places where some form of dimensional anomaly, spatial distortion, or breach in ordinary reality allowed people to vanish. This isn't science fiction necessarily. Modern physics recognizes phenomena, wormholes, black holes, quantum entanglement, that seem to violate our conventional understanding of how the universe works. It's not unreasonable to speculate that localized, naturally occurring phenomena of this type might exist in certain geographic areas. The electromagnetic anomalies detected by surveyors could be a symptom of such a phenomenon. The light phenomena reported by witnesses could be the visible manifestation of a dimensional distortion. The animal behavior changes could reflect animal awareness of these zones. The government's silence would be perfectly understandable. How do you admit to the public that large areas of national land contain phenomena that science can't explain, and that operating within those phenomena poses unknown risks? As we sit in the 21st century, more than 70 years after the peak of the 1945-1950 disappearances, we must confront an unsettling question. What does it mean that a democratic nation, supposedly transparent and accountable to its citizens, systematically erased a historical event in which hundreds of people vanished? This isn't a minor historical footnote. This isn't a forgotten scandal that didn't really matter. Hundreds of people died or vanished. Hundreds of families were left wondering what happened to their loved ones. An entire chapter of American history was deliberately hidden from public knowledge. The mechanism of this erasure, the media suppression, the document destruction, the institutional silence, the pressure on families, reveals something important about how power actually operates in American society. It shows us that when the government decides a truth is dangerous, it has the institutional capacity to make that truth disappear. The disappearances themselves, whatever caused them, reveal something important about the American wilderness. It shows us that large areas of the nation remain beyond our understanding and beyond our control. Despite all our technology, all our science, all our mapping and documentation, there are regions where people step out of existence and we cannot explain why. While institutions can classify documents and maintain silence, individual human beings cannot forget. The families of the disappeared have carried the weight of these mysteries across generations. Margaret Chen, now in her 90s, has spent her life investigating the disappearance of her father, who vanished in 1948 while hiking near Crater Lake. She has compiled 2 decades of research, tracked down witnesses, collected documents, and attempted to construct a coherent narrative of what happened. When asked why she continues, given that she's unlikely to find definitive answers, she responds, "Someone has to remember. Someone has to care. My father was a real person. He lived, he laughed, he loved his family. He didn't deserve to simply disappear from history as well as from life. The government wants us to forget. They want us to pretend it never happened. But I remember. My family remembers. And maybe, someday, the truth will matter more than the silence." Michael Chen, Margaret's son and a journalist, has attempted to publish his family's research and his investigation into the disappearances. He has found that mainstream publishers are reluctant to touch the subject. Academic institutions show little interest in engaging with the material. The disappearances remain, quite deliberately, invisible. Yet the families persist. They preserve documents, share stories, maintain oral histories. They are the custodians of a memory that the government tried to erase. The mountains of America remain beautiful, recreational, and generally safe. Millions of people hike them annually without incident. The wilderness, despite its mysteries, is accessible and largely hospitable to human presence. But in certain regions, in certain areas, something remains. The precise nature of that something is unknowable, at least to those of us who remain on the outside of the government's classified files and secret knowledge. The silent scars are there, though, the places where people stepped into the wilderness and ceased to be, the gaps in historical records, the families still seeking answers decades later, the knowledge held by some institution or some individuals of what really happened, knowledge deemed too dangerous or too incomprehensible to share with the public. The story of the 1945-1950 disappearances stands as a peculiar testament to American history. It's not the kind of historical event that gets taught in schools or discussed in mainstream media. It's not the kind of event that shapes our national narrative or our self-understanding, but it's real. The people who disappeared were real. The investigations that occurred were real. The decision to hide the truth was real. And in that reality lies a question that Americans should perhaps be asking more often. What other truths have we been asked to forget? The wilderness still claims people. The mystery still remains unsolved. And somewhere in government archives, the truth sits in classified files, waiting for a day when humanity might finally be ready to understand what happened in those mountains between 1945 and 1950. Until that day comes, the disappearances remain silent scars on the American landscape, a mystery that refuses to be completely erased, no matter how hard institutions try to make it vanish.